Substance abuse in the Berkshires is a problem. While Massachusetts opioid deaths continue to go down, the Berkshires is keeping a high steady, and it doesn't take very long to find a teenager using a substance they clearly shouldn't be. So what causes these problems, and how can we help? Well, let's find out.
So if I may, I'd like to present this video, which is the collaboration of myself, Aiden C, the Berkshire District Attorney, Andrea Harrington, Dr. Jennifer Michaels at the Brain Center, and Dennis Carr, the Vice Principal of Reed Middle School in Pittsfield. I interviewed these three people to get multiple different perspectives on what substance abuse is, how it affects a daily life, and how we can help it and raise awareness for it. To start off, I interviewed the Berkshire District Attorney, Andrea Harrington, at her office.
Dear Harrington is quite educated on this subject and deals with this kind of thing on a day-to-day basis. I interviewed her to get her perspective on how substance abuse affects the Berkshires.
So my first question is, how do you think COVID-19 has affected the substance abuse rates in the Berkshires?
Well, the Department of Public Health recently put out their statistics from 2020, which showed a significant increase in opioid overdoses for 2020. Statewide, the increase in fatal overdoses was 5%, but in Berkshire County it was 44% increase, which is huge. My expectation, although we don't have the numbers specifically from 2021 yet, is that we'll see an increase in overdose fatalities over last year. And, from talking to and hearing from medical professionals in this area, the isolation of COVID and the stress maybe has caused some people to relapse, people who are struggling with substance use disorder. There's been a disruption in people's kind of normal communities and the way that people find stability, and the kind of protective factors from using drugs have been interrupted. So I expect that, we're going to see increased numbers of overdoses from the tail end of the pandemic.
What do you think are the most common ways that people, both kids and adults, will tend to get a hold of these substances that they're not supposed to have?
Wow, okay, so we have a real problem in terms of young people accessing marijuana, which is legal for adults, but because it's legal for adults, it's a lot more available now to young people. But what we see in terms of how people access substances is really they use social media a lot, different, whether it's Snapchat or Facebook Marketplace or other kinds of online places to, find and sell illegal substances.
Which do you think tend to use substances that they're not supposed to be more, kids or adults?
Do I think kids or adults tend to use substances that they're not supposed to more? That's a good question. When you look, there's a assessment that is done every year of 8th graders that measures, young people and their well-being, and those results show that young people in Berkshire County are not using. They're a little bit above the national average in terms of using substances. The bigger concern from those results is the rates of depression among young people here in Berkshire County. So it's hard for me to say. 5% of our population is addicted to opioids, so that would be the adult population, which is very, very high. That's a high percentage rate. I think that it's probably, similar, because I think that the patterns of adults are probably somewhat copied by the young.
Wait, what substance do you think is abused the most in the Berkshires? People in Berkshire have the biggest problem.
Yeah, so the substance that has been of the most concern, I think, are opioids, because they're so highly addictive. But, you know, I keep hearing from, like, the Department of Justice and the FBI and the DEA that we should expect to see more stimulants in our community. So stimulants are like cocaine, methamphetamine, and there's something called right now called the fourth wave of the opioid epidemic, which is polysubstance use. So we're seeing a lot more people that are using multiple substances, like mixing opioids and stimulants, which used to be very unusual. But we do see that more and more, and it's hard for first responders because they don't necessarily know exactly what they're dealing with when they respond to an emergency. The other challenge is, you know, with opioids, we have good treatment. We have medically assisted treatment, like Suboxone or Methadone, which are highly effective in treating those disorders. But we don't have, there's no treatments for like methamphetamine and for cocaine. So it's really a mixed bag, but I mean, most often prevalent in our community really is the opioids. So like heroin, fentanyl, definitely still got the biggest hold here in Berkshire County.
How do first responders generally try to deal with an issue when someone may contact them about that?
Like, you mean if they get a 911 call to go to a scene?
That sort of thing.
Yeah. So, you know, I know this is maybe not my area of expertise, but from what I can see, you know, if somebody calls 911, you know, we have something called the Good Samaritan law. So we want to make sure that people feel confident that if they call 911 to get help for somebody who's had an overdose, that they're not going to be arrested or get in trouble with the police. So the Good Samaritan law protects people who are reporting an overdose from any kind of criminal prosecution, which is very important for people to know, because we don't want people to be hesitating to call 911 or to get help if somebody's having an overdose. The other piece is, you know, the first responders will, you know, the people, the 911 dispatchers, you know, they stay on the phone with the caller, they give them instructions about, you know, making sure airways are not obstructed, how to do CPR. Really, all of our first responders should have Narcan. So Narcan is an opioid reversal that can save lives, and it's very, very important for people to carry Narcan. Not all of our police departments do carry Narcan, which is pretty frustrating, but our EMTs do. So, you know, they'll give somebody Narcan to try to reverse the overdose, bring people to the hospital. We're definitely working to have more public health responses to overdose. So there's a new program that's starting, that's run by the Berkshire Opioid Prevention Collaborative, called a Post-Overdose Response Team. And it's really not a law enforcement focused group, it's really a public health focused group, but they do follow up with people who have recently experienced an overdose to try to just make sure people are safe and healthy.
What would you say that someone should do if they are having a problem with substance use? How would they try to, would 911 be the best course of action for that?
That's a really good question. In this office, we very much try to promote something called harm reduction. Harm reduction is, you know, an approach that says, you know, we just want to help people and keep people safe. If they're using drugs, if they're not using drugs. In the past, I think there's been a real focus on only helping people who are abstaining from drug use. And we've seen a lot of people die, and it creates a stigma so that the people who need help are not getting help. So I think it's really important for people who are using drugs, don't use alone. there's an organization called Never Use Alone where you can actually call them or like be on like Zoom with them, so that if you overdose, they know, and they will call 911 so that somebody can come and administer Narcan or rescue the individual. There's a lot of advice around. There's fentanyl test strips. People can test their drugs for fentanyl to kind of make sure like that they have some idea of what's in them. So often people get a drug and thinks it's one thing, but it's laced with fentanyl, which is incredibly dangerous. Other things that we advise people to do, like go low and slow, communicate with people about what's out there so that you know like what to stay away from. In terms of people actually getting help and treatment and support, there's not like treatment on demand in Berkshire County. We have like way fewer treatment beds and treatment options. The Green Center can direct people to treatment. There's a new agency in Southern Berkshire called Rural Recovery Services that for South County to help people get into treatment. You can contact Mass Health to try to get a treatment bed. You can call Berkshire Health Systems, and people will, try to help people find treatment. First people need to do detox, and they need to do like a long-term recovery.
So my final question is, how would you say that just the everyday average person can try to help the issue and raise awareness for it?
Thank you for that question. And I think removing the stigma around substance use disorder is the biggest thing that we can do to help people be healthy and get the help that they need. So many people that I talk to and parents who have lost their children to substance use disorder talk about the fact that their kids didn't get help because they just were tired and feeling ashamed and judged. I've heard just the worst stories about, a young person seeking treatment and being just like talked down to and really mistreated by the people that, doctors and like, different parts of the community, like just not treating people like human beings. So I think the biggest thing that we all can do is just to treat people with kindness and respect and support the idea that substance use disorder is a public health issue. It's like having diabetes or like having cancer or any kind of illness. It's a medical condition that requires a medical response. We're not going to arrest and prosecute our way out of the drug issue, because if that worked, then we wouldn't have anybody struggling with substance use disorder here in Berkshire County. We've tried it, it doesn't work. So we really need to just have good, strong public health. And I think, becoming politically engaged and supporting candidates for office, for Senate, for governor, for the House, who want to, increase our access to medical care. It's a great way to solve this problem.
So how would you, I know you're saying people could get politically involved. So how would someone, say of my age, try to get politically involved in that way? To try to help issues just like this?
I think that you can contact your legislators. So if you live in Pittsfield, Tricia Farley-Bouvier is your representative. Adam Hines is your state senator. I think contacting their offices, letting them know that you support harm reduction or you support increased access to health care for people with substance use disorder. Ask their offices, like, is there any legislation or any budget considerations? Now we have a lot of COVID relief money coming to the state and the municipalities, so that's an opportunity for you to say that we would like to see COVID relief money used to better support people with substance use disorder. So you can advocate and lobby with your legislators. Certainly you could get involved in political campaigns if you're interested in that. There's a lot of great work for young people to do on a campaign. I told you about our youth advisory board here in the district attorney's office. So that's for high school students. So people that want to work with my office on these issues with other young people, like we have a lot of opportunity there.
Dr. Michaels and her coworkers at the Breeding Center deal with people who are struggling with substance abuse every single day, and gave her perspective on how substance abuse affects the brain and body of someone with using substances.
So, first question, what kind of effects substance abuse can generally have on the body?
Well, I think if a person uses excessive amounts or uses frequently, it can have a negative effect on a person's brain and body. And I remember being in medical school, and a professor said to me, if you want to learn every single system in the body, just learn about the effects that alcohol has on humans. Because alcohol can affect, from the top of your head to the bottom of your toes, every single organ system in your body. So, for example, alcohol, small amounts or controlled amounts, people can drink pretty fine. It's when people use large amounts of alcohol and use it frequently, something called binge drinking, that every organ in the body can have a negative effect.
What kind of treatment would somebody like you or your coworkers in the office give to someone struggling with substance abuse?
Well, what we do is something called treatment matching. So we don't have a cookie-cutter approach to every person. We assess what's going on with them. We ask people what they're interested in doing, and then we match the person with their needs and what we call evidence-based care, meaning that we don't just make it up. The treatments we provide have been load-tested, they've been studied in large groups of people, and they work. And so we offer people evidence-based treatment that they would like to have. We don't force people to do things they don't want to do.
When you think of substance abuse, you think of alcohol, cannabis, but in my research and my interview with the DA, I found that not a lot of people will focus on opioids, not a lot of people are educated what opioids are. What are some of the effects that opioids have?
Well, people are more likely to have problems with alcohol or marijuana. However, opioids are also commonly used. And the problem with opioids is that, first of all, they can suppress breathing, so people can overdose and die. And opioids on the street now are so strong that people using for the first time accidentally overdose and die. Also, the way opioids are used is very problematic. People often inject opioids, and that can be associated with infections, with shared needles, with hepatitis, with cardiac or heart disease. So, there's a whole host of things, of negative consequences.
What do you think are some of the things that make common substances so good?
That's a great question, especially when we think about young people, because I brought my brain today because you said you were interested in brain. Young people are developing, they're growing their brains. And so we look at a brain, this is how it would sit in my head or in your head like that. And so young people are growing their brains, they're not fully developed until they're about 25. And so for young people, if you look inside the brain, if you're really young, this is the brainstem. That's the part that matures earliest on, and that's why we're born breathing and we can function and have normal temperature. This part of the brain is the CEO, the cortex, the frontal cortex, and that is not fully developed in young people. And so when people use substances, they're not using the part of the brain that knows better or thinks of consequences. And it can have a negative impact on the entire brain. It can delay the most advanced part of the brain from fully developing. And the other thing is when you're young, you're developing lifelong habits. And so we can develop wonderful lifelong habits, or we can develop terrible lifelong habits. So if we start to use substances when we're really young and we use them frequently, we're more likely to develop an addiction, the habit of using substances or becoming really addicted. Whereas if we delay exposure to substances, we're less likely to have problems with our brain and developing.
Right. So someone that starts, let's say, smoke cigarettes or something like that, when they're older, will have an easier time to get off. But someone would try to get addicted when they were my age will have a really hard time getting off when they're older. Because that's burned in your brain.
Yeah, it's like hardwired into your brain. So think of it this way. You know how you say that when you're very young, it's easy to learn a second language. Like it's really easy to hardwire language or any habit or any learning in a young brain. It's really easy to wire your brain, hardwire it for addictions. Once you're older, it's less likely to happen. So I don't try to scare young people. I just say that if you delay exposure, it's the other thing that can happen that's really problematic is when you're young, you're figuring out what feels good, like I like this or I don't like that, or this healthy food or unhealthy food. You're learning what's pleasurable. That's a normal part of growing up. The problem with using substances earlier is that they activate our brain's reward systems orders of magnitude greater than the natural rewards that we can get. And so it kind of outperforms other natural rewards. So then things that might normally feel good when you're young don't really register, and substances are more likely to be what you'll see if you use them regularly. Does that make sense? And the reward system is in this part of the brain. It's mediated by the neurotransmitter dopamine, and we end up with kind of an emotional memory for rewarding events. And if you keep using and using, you end up wiring your brain for addiction. So when you stop using, you experience withdrawal, and withdrawal feels awful. And then you seek the substance to escape withdrawal. And so your brain is then further wired to the substance. It's like you're saying.
So, how can a young person's substance use affect their productivity or
That's a good question. I mean, we know that if you use substances or use a good amount of them, that your performance that day will be impaired, the next day, and maybe even the day after. That there have been studies looking at athletes who drink excessively or use a lot of marijuana, and it has a negative impact on their performance. Same thing with cognitive impacts. It's not just for that short period while you're using, but the next day your brain is recovering from using. So, you take work teachers, specializing in that.
So, at the Brain Center, do you think that your goal is to treat kids who
That's a great question because there's a course of this disease. An addiction is a disease. It's a brain disease. I would say it's a bad disease. The people who have it are bad people. It takes a while from initial use to progression to more regular use to having a bad problem. And what we see is that usually people don't come to get help. It could be the 20s to 30s when they get help. And then there are exceptions. There are some young people who do seek help. So most of our patients are adults.
So, obviously, have you ever treated someone for use of an illegal drug?
Every day. So every day at the Brain Center, we help people who are struggling with cocaine addiction, heroin addiction, and by the way, heroin is bought on the street is now mostly fentanyl. It's really potent, synthetic opioid, much more lethal. They're all bad, but we've kind of progressed to more
final question is, how would you think just the everyday average person try to help the issue, try to raise awareness?
I think my wish would be that the everyday average person begin to understand, begin to view addiction as a brain disease, and to view it as a life-threatening brain disease. So to understand the urgency, the need for compassion, for generosity, for treatment, for funding. So if someone has cancer, we don't shame them and blame them, we help them. If someone has heart disease, we get them immediate care. In the same way, if somebody has an addiction, we want to get them immediate care and have compassion. And if we can begin to have that conversation about how we can help people the way we do with other diseases, I think we'll go really far in helping people.
From day to day, Dennis deals with students at Reed Middle School and has occasionally found substances. He's also lost a loved one to substance abuse whose name has been cut from the interview. In the interview, he gave his perspective on both of these experiences.
So, my first question for you is, since you're the vice principal of Reed in Pittsfield, roughly how many cases do you think that you get of students having a substance that they clearly shouldn't have?
That we find out about? We may only have between 5 and 10 a year or so. But I believe that there are a lot more that we don't find out about. And if we're talking about, and actually depends on what you're talking about. We don't really, it's rare for us to deal with alcohol. We will sometimes deal with weed. We will frequently be dealing with kids who have vapes on them, or reports that they've been doing it in the bathroom or whatever. So, like I said, I believe more than we know about.
Where do you think they get the substances? Because obviously they can't just walk into a store and buy them.
Right. Some of them get them from other kids. Some of them buy them from other kids or in kids out in the community. We have had some that parents have known or even given them to their kids before, but I believe mostly they get them from other kids.
Have you ever had a case where a kid has had an illegal substance like cocaine or heroin or something a bit more intense?
No.
No.
Like I said, we've had an occasional alcohol, some weed, some weed-based products in vapes, but we've never had any hard, we've never had any cocaine, heroin, anything like that. No.
So, I know this is a much more sensitive topic, so you could take it lightly if you'd like to, and take it light, but so I know you told me you have a lost loved one to addiction.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Could you try to describe the situation he was in leading up to that point?
Sure. And he was one of those people who you could describe as, the expression, he'd give you the shirt off his back. He was one of those people who you could describe as, the expression, he'd give you the shirt off his back. He was just a really super nice, kind, helpful, if you were moving or you needed some kind of project, that you needed some help on a project or whatever, he'd be the first one there, he'd be the last to leave. He was just a guy that everybody was crazy about. And he started smoking weed and drinking mostly beer when we were teenagers, and on both of his parents' sides of the family, his mother, my aunt, and on his dad's side of the family too, there is a genetic predisposition to substance addiction, and that's what happened to him. And he struggled with staying sober, and he struggled with smoking marijuana, and for much of his life, from the time he was 14, 15 years old. He was in rehab several times, which didn't really have an impact on him. He reached a point where he was unable to keep a job, even with his long-time employer, who was very patient with him. After many years, finally said enough. He was unable to make his marriage work because his wife, for a short time, just couldn't handle it anymore. He eventually permanently lost his driver's license because of the number of DWIs he had, and by the time he was in his late 40s, he reached a point where he had been an alcoholic for so long that he appeared as if he was drunk all the time, even if there were occasions when he wasn't drinking. You know, he slurred his words, and you would have thought he was drunk even, you know, first thing in the morning when he woke up, just because his body was saturated. And then one day, two years ago, he was drunk and high, and he tripped, and he fell down the cellar stairs and hit his head, which caused him to have a seizure. That because his brain had been so damaged by years of alcohol abuse, that he couldn't recover from, and was on life support for about a week. And then my aunt and uncle, his parents, and his brother, my cousin, had to make were told that there was nothing that they could do, and so they had to decide to disconnect him. And he died. Once they disconnected him, he was gone in about 5 minutes. And it was very difficult. I went to see him. He was at BMC before they moved him to Bay State, where he died. And I went up to see him before we knew that he was not going to recover. And, just laying there with the tubes and the wires and the hose in his mouth and the whole thing, which was entirely related to, substance abuse, is what brought him to that point. Yep.
Thank you for telling me that story.
Of course.
Now.
Of course.
Um,
And it just, I'll add to that, the sad part was that as sad as the whole thing was, it wasn't really much of a surprise to any, it wasn't an oh my God situation, because it was sort of like, oh, finally. And that's sad, that's really sad. Yep.
What would you say if you knew another person who was in the kind of situation you were in with a loved one who had addiction? What would you say to them before the person's passing that could try to help the person?
That's really hard, because addiction, we know more and more about addiction, and addiction can be genetic and physical. It's not just, oh, I think I'm going to have another beer. I would encourage them as much as I could to get help. I would keep talking to them. I don't know that it helps to tell stories like that to people who are addicted, because I don't think they I'm not sure they can connect with that or not. I would encourage them. I would offer them support. I suppose you can say, I watched a loved one go through this, and it wasn't pretty, and I've watched what it did to his family, especially in the aftermath of watching his parents, lose a child and all that. And just try to encourage them to get the help they need, because people who are addicted, I think it's really unusual for them to just cold turkey say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I think it requires a lot of help and services that they have to be willing to want to access, I think.
So once again, I thank you for doing this interview. So my final question to you is, how would you say that just an everyday average person, and maybe even of my age, could try to help this situation and raise awareness for it? Because that is the goal here.
To raise awareness, I think to just encourage kids, as tempting as it is to stay away, just to remember that, especially with the hard stuff, once you get addicted, you're stuck for life. I just think to remind people that it's nothing to be curious about, to remind people not, to be strong enough to resist peer pressure, and that you don't have to look cool by trying things that you might not want to try, because there's too much risk involved.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
To D.A. Harrington, Dr. Michaels, and Mr. Carr, thank you all for doing the interviews. And to the viewers out there, I hope you found something informative about this video. Thank you.